I think I'm okay. No, I think I'm okay. I had a presentation for this one on there, but I'm going second, I think. So anyway, Chuck doesn't have any.
I can stand up.
In which direction?
So this is it.
Okay.
And you just go forward and backwards.
Okay.
And then this middle one is a laser if you want
Oh,
to use the...
okay. Trying not to put someone's eye
Yeah.
out of it.
Be aware.
Yeah.
Oh, I think I just exited one. I hope that wasn't... Do you know which one was yours?
Mine's right there, DOW.
Okay. This is Tom's. Perfect. Now, do you don't mind if I leave the screen down a little bit dark, or do you want me to put it down?
That's fine. That's fine. It's not a problem. Okay. Mary. Didn't mean to say hi. Hey.
If you would come in and grab a seat, please, we'll get on with this next session. I'm David Hinton from the Nicholas School. I work with aquatic toxicology. It was a surprise to me while a professor at West Virginia University to get a call from people at University of California, Davis, wanting to know if I would be interested in coming out to help them with some toxicology issues involved around aquaculture. That was my first time really in California, and it lasted for 15 years. I was concerned about things that were affecting aquaculture fish, and there were several programs going from sturgeon through striped bass, including some others that I won't mention. And it gave you the opportunity to see very quickly that there were lots of integrated interests, and as one colleague told me, you can be fried in the water problems in the Central Valley. So you've got to be very careful, and you've got to do the best work that you can and communicate your findings. So the fish that we began to work with, which later evolved more into an assessment of off-site movement of pesticides and other agricultural compounds, led to an evaluation of their effect on migratory fish and resident fish species, and some work with birds. So I have seen the changes that occur when fish and birds are exposed to selenium, this time from the alluvial soils that, when irrigated, were releasing that water. The Fish and Wildlife Service was very interested in getting water to have more resting ponds for migratory birds, and that's the major part of that Pacific Flyway. So to know that you could use water and then find out that the water that was being used had its own issues with it just raises further the complexities of some things in environmental issues. It was really interesting to me to attend a lot of meetings around CalFed, this coming together of federal and state agencies to address this problem so that we could go forward, not with every stakeholder happy, but agreeing to meet, and it would be better for all together. To see that fall apart for a variety of reasons was really dashing, but then to your hopes, but then after you begin to see what comes next, you see that a lot of the actual things that were in these different programs get carried forward, the ideas. And so you begin to see that, hey, the wording was good, the thoughts were good, but the implementation, the action. And so out there, it was really interesting to have this little Hoover Commission. In my area of science, if we work in like a center of different investigators, like we have here at the Duke campus with our Superfund program, then what the government wants to see from us is more than just a sum of the parts, but a lot of synergism. And so you realize that you have to develop trust, you have to be willing to talk, and you have to share. And then I started seeing it from the standpoint of people who were at middle level or even lower positions, and how much do they really believe that when their people are telling them, we need to get involved in this work, and so how much of my time each week can I actually put to that? If we start accepting these new initiatives and new objectives, is this going to be an issue? So it became an understanding of interpersonal and individual gifts and commitments. And so these things are really hard to implement. They sound good up here, but then as they go down this way, it becomes a strong need to really evaluate how effectively are we doing. And could we put some of these different agencies with a slightly different name and model together in a way that would do it much better? So from CalFed, the Blue Ribbon Bay Delta Report, and then the Bay Delta Conservation Program. All of these are incredibly interesting and moving documents, and at the same time, a real set of dreams. So if you think about this Delta region, which is the confluence of the San Joaquin River and the Sacramento River, it is really the transfer station for this whole water system throughout much of the state. And it's receiving a lot of attention now. Can the water be produced and delivered? And can you hold on to ecosystem values and concepts? So trying to defend what little fish like the Delta Smelt can tell you about ecosystem services, and trying to sell that, and then seeing signs that say, why is it fish versus farmers? And you know, these are all of the issues where it really hits the road. And so even though these comments are about California, it's really the same when you look at these maps and you see watersheds that cross state lines, you see watersheds that move from one portion of the state to another, and you wonder, as one of the other speakers asked, what does Southern California and its wants and desires have to do with us in Northern California? So these are the kinds of issues that really hit upon me in a major way. We were trying to run a UC system-wide program in ecotoxicology, and there was a lot of traveling to the different UC campuses, trying to, with small amounts of money, entice ecologists to come out and work with toxicologists, biologists, and some engineers. And then you get an opportunity to come to Duke, to the School of the Environment, and you think maybe this is going to be a lot less travel and more time to focus. So it's from this kind of perspective that I'm talking to you now. I was raised in Mississippi. I spent time at various universities here, had this opportunity to go and really be involved in very exciting work in California, and then come here. So I think from the last speaker's comments that all of these issues are major. They're starting to talk now about, can we build more reservoirs to store more water? There are efforts to try to learn more about the systems of veins and arteries that involve in the Earth's crust, so that maybe in times of heavy water supply or flooding, massive amounts of water could be directed into aquifers. And then you think about this 60-year or more time of intensive agriculture, and the fact that most of these well samples show you that the compounds that were associated with the land uses have now penetrated into the aquifer. So how much is creating quality groundwater as a source for human consumption going to cost more in the future? And all of this kind of sets this goal. And it's not just a California issue, but it's a Western issue. And that's the sort of introduction I would like to give you, and then sit down and be quiet and think about some questions that we can do. But Kim Delfino is our first speaker, and ask her to come.
All right, well, good afternoon. I just want to thank the law students at Duke University that invited me to come here. I'm very excited to come all the way across the country and speak to you about Western water issues. I'm going to focus, not too surprisingly, on the state of California because that's my experience. Just as a little background about myself, I've been the California Director for Defenders of Wildlife for 16 years, and during those 16 years, I've worked on California water issues because I think it's impossible to do wildlife work, fish and wildlife work, without water. Everything needs water. I've worked on the Salton Sea, which is a very interesting issue tucked down in the southern corner of California, which we'll get to touched on a little bit in the context of the intersection of international, national, and state water issues when we talk about something called Minute 319. But I've also worked on the Bay Delta issue for many years. In fact, I almost wish I could get paid for the amount of hours I've spent in meetings talking about the Delta. I worked on the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, which is now known as WaterFix, Cal WaterFix. And then I also served for several years on the California Water Commission, and I sit on the board of the Water Education Foundation. So I have a pretty good understanding of California water. So I want to give you just a little bit of background because I think it's important to understand the hydrology of the state and sort of what's going on to get an understanding of why we're facing the problems we're facing. So here's a map of California. The blue is where the rain typically falls, and the red is where the people live. You can see that the rain doesn't necessarily fall where the people live. And that's actually a big problem because now we have to figure out how we're going to move all that water down to where you actually need it. So that then created what is California's massive water infrastructure, massive. So we have the Sacramento River, San Joaquin River, and the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and that was just discussed a minute ago. But that is the major water delivery rivers in the state of California, and the Delta is the largest freshwater ecosystem estuary in the United States. And massive amounts of water move through that area and underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. So if you're ever standing on the Golden Gate Bridge, you're looking at huge amounts of snowpack and river water moving at least at some point in time during the day out into the Pacific Ocean. Then we have in the yellow the Central Valley Project, and that was discussed. That is the federal water project. So the federal government came in, dammed up Shasta Lake and created the Shasta Dam, and then a few other dams that are out there, Friant and some others, Folsom, and then started moving water around the state. And then in the red, you have the State Water Project. The main reservoir is Oroville, Lake Oroville, and that moves water mainly to Southern California. So let me just take it back up. The yellow, the federal project, really moves more water to agricultural areas, where the State Water Project really moves more water towards Los Angeles and Southern California where they need it. And then you have local water projects, which are not terribly small. So the green, those are the green areas, and you can see up top, the green line there is the Mokolame pipeline that feeds water to the East Bay Water District. Then you have the longer one that's just below it. That starts in Yosemite, Hetch Hetchy, and delivers all the water to San Francisco. And then you have the long green line comes down to LA, and that's the infamous Owens Lake. If you ever saw the movie Chinatown, that was the purchase of pretty much the entire Owens Lake Valley area and moving water to LA, courtesy of Mr. Mulholland. And then you have the Metropolitan Water District's canal coming in from the Colorado River, and that delivers an enormous amount of water as well. So we have plumbed our state to move water pretty much everywhere. And that's an important point I'm going to get back to in a minute. So this is actually an old slide. You had it earlier. I just was lazy and didn't put in a new slide. But the point being is we've been in the midst of a massive drought for the last 4 years. Although it shouldn't have come as any great surprise to anyone who lives in California that we're going to have a drought. I mean, I remember the serious drought in the 70s. Then we had drought in the 80s, and then we had drought in the 90s, and now we have the drought in the 2000s. We live in a droughty area. This one, though, is pretty serious because it has been 4 years of severe drought. Now, compounding that is climate change, and this maybe shows more of the effects of the drought, but it is something we have to be very mindful of because we rely greatly on snow melt to provide water. And if we don't have snow, we don't have water, and the reservoirs don't fill up. And the drought we've been facing thus far, has hammered our snowpack. But it's something we have to pay attention to, because when you look at climate models for the state of California, the models are showing that we should rely less and less on snowpack, that we will have warmer, wetter, flashier systems, and water will be delivered to the state of California more in rainfall than it will be in snowpack. Unfortunately, all of those water systems that I showed you, all those nice colorful lines on the map, a lot of them have been designed to accommodate a snowpack-driven system. So it's something we have to be mindful of. So then the question was asked, is the drought over? No. Not by any stretch. Yes, we have El Nino. Yes, we finally have rain in California. Yes, our snowpack is heading towards 150% of normal this year. But as you can see, based on the map there, our reservoirs are, after 4 years of drawing them down, we'll need several years of El Nino to get back to where we need to be. We are only at 24% on the Central Valley Project, which is Lake Shasta mainly, and Friant. And then meanwhile, as our reservoirs have been dropping, we've been just pumping the heck out of our groundwater. And in California, we were, I have to say, behind every state. Even Texas regulated groundwater, but California did not. And it wasn't until we actually passed legislation last year to begin to start to manage our groundwater that people could pretty much just pump at will, and they did. And we have subsidence in the Central Valley of where land has dropped more than 20 feet because we've pumped. It's literally like deflating a balloon. More water you pump out, the farther the land drops. And we are in 21 basins at critical overdraft, which creates all kinds of problems, because if anyone's ever been on a well system, when your groundwater drops, you have to drill that well further. And that is very expensive for some people. And we actually have communities in California right now that have no availability of water. They have to truck water in. There's an area called East Porterville. It's a very, very poor area. They have no clean water. Everything is done off bottled water. And that's not unfortunately unique. And so, there was a point made about environmental justice. That's very much coming into play in the state of California. A couple years ago, we passed a bill in our state legislature embodying the human right to water. And so everyone deserves to be able to open up their tap and get clean, reliable water. But even as a state, as advanced as we like to think, in California, we don't provide that to a lot of people. And that's actually a travesty, I think. And then the other reason why the drought's not over, great. We've had a year of rain, which is nice. Finally get to ski again. But there's some discussion that La Nina may be on the heels of El Nino. And La Nina means then we'll be entering another dry period. So I really hope that we don't do what we did in the past, which is get some nice years of rain and completely and conveniently forget that we are in a droughty system and not address the underlying structural problems. So I want to just talk a little bit about the impacts. I work for Defenders of Wildlife, so of course I'm going to care about the wildlife issues. That's not to say I don't care about the fact that people don't have access to water and that it has had impacts to the ag community and it has been economically disruptive to our state. But Fish and Wildlife in the state of California have been hammered. And part of the reason why is because they were already sort of living on the precipice to begin with. When you replumb the entire state of California with a series of canals and dams, you reclaim all of the Central Valley, which was predominantly wetlands at the time and now is agricultural land. The amount of habitat and streams that Fish and Wildlife can use drastically goes down. So for example, in wetlands, we've lost 90% of the wetlands in the state of California. So we only have 10% of our wetlands left. When you're a migratory bird and you're flying from, say, South America up to Alaska, and you're looking down at the state of California, there's just not a lot of wet areas to land in. And so when you then compound this with drought, it just takes a species that were already sort of hanging on the brink to begin with, and it just puts another pressure on them. So winter run Chinook salmon, you look at the map there, The reach, that reach between the two red lines is pretty much where most of the spawning is occurring for salmon. The problem we had in 2014 and 2015 is we weren't releasing enough water out of Shasta Dam at the right temperature, so the salmon fry and smolts literally cooked. And we lost 95 to 98% mortality of 2 of the 3 years of runs. And if you know anything about salmon, they go in 3-year cycles. So this is it. 2016 is the last of the 3-year cycle, and if we don't manage Shasta Dam properly, we will potentially cause winter run salmon to become functionally extinct. But for the species that we're then bringing into hatcheries and raising them as hatchery fish. Okay, and then of course there's the fish that gets all the attention, which is the smelt, because everyone, not everyone, but some folks love to hate the smelt, because apparently the smelt is the cause of all of our problems in California. It's not the 4 years of drought, it's not the mismanaging of our water supply, it's that stupid little fish that's just, we're not able to water our farmlands because of it. But the smelt, really, I look at it as a canary in the coal mine. It was at one time, we actually had a smelt fishery. There were so many smelt in the estuary, they would fish them for commercial purposes. Last year, our mid-water fall trawl found 1 smelt. I'm assuming there's others out there, so at least we have 2, so they can have more. But the smelt is just, I think, the indicator that we have really mismanaged this system horribly. And then birds, I mentioned the issue with the fact that we have shrinking wetlands. The Central Valley Project Improvement Act is supposed to dedicate water to wetlands, and we have a series of federal wildlife refuges running up and down the Central Valley. You can see here that the ability to flood acres up at critical times for when birds are moving through the system has been drastically hindered. And so the problem is more and more birds are coming through the system, but they're congregating on these little tiny patches of wetland, and it causes huge problems with disease. In fact, we had a big avian botulism outbreak up in the Klamath Refuge, which is one of our biggest refuges, precisely because of this issue of you're crowding birds together. So it is not a very pleasant experience if you're a fish or a bird. And then, I always like to put the plug in for the fuzzy critters too, because it's not as obvious. But our wildlife has been hammered. San Joaquin kit fox and this little guy, giant kangaroo rat. They live in the grasslands of California. If you go out to what we have left of the grasslands, it's not even grass anymore, it's dirt. So some of these species are literally on the brink of extinction. Hopefully with the rain, they'll bounce back. Fortunately, they're big breeders, so that hopefully they'll bounce. But like Amargosa vole that lives on the Amargosa River along the border between California and Nevada, our Department of Fish and Wildlife had to literally take in the last few remaining voles into a captive breeding program in order to genetically preserve the species. Like, we're operating on that level of intensive management for species in order to keep extinctions from occurring. So what do we have to do? That is the $64,000 billion question. Our governor, I think, makes a very good point, and I think a fairly obvious one. There's no magic bullet. Water fix, Bay Delta Conservation Plan, whatever you want to call it, that's not going to fix the problem entirely, or if at all. Building new reservoirs, that's not necessarily going to fix the problem. It's going to be everything that you can possibly come up with kind of approach. We need water use efficiency. We need recycling and gray water use. I mean, the fact that people are watering their lawns with potable water is ridiculous. People just need to get over it. You can put gray water on your lawn. In fact, frankly, you shouldn't even have a lawn if you live in California. Groundwater cleanup and management. This is a huge issue for us. So what little groundwater we have left, some of it is very contaminated with nitrogen. I'm sure you guys can understand that because of the water quality issues you have here, but we have a large dairy industry, and that's created great problems with nitrogen contaminating our water supply. And then natural infrastructure. When I talk about natural infrastructure, there's ways of capturing water and replenishing aquifers and addressing flooding through just letting nature take its course. So, for example, instead of rip-wrapping rivers up to up to the edge, you could create floodplains again. And then floodplains have this amazing way of both taking in floodwaters and relieving pressure downstream on communities that live there, but also replenishing aquifers and reconnecting aquifers to the streams. And we need to be spending more time figuring out ways to do that than, say, rip-wrapping levees. And then smart water storage. And I call it smart water storage because in my mind, you have to look at all the options. And frankly, in California, I think the era of building big reservoirs is over, and that we need to be actually looking at groundwater storage and conjunctive use. Reservoir reoperation is another one. Those are all the things that we have to be addressing. So really, for me, the issue that I focus in on is managing our water system without harming fish and wildlife. It's not an easy thing to do when you're also balancing all the other issues. Quickly, because I know we have a limited amount of time, I want to just talk about one tool that's picking up a lot of interest, water transfers. So we have this water system that's just been plumbed from one end of the state to the other. So we have an ability to move water around our state where we need it the most. And because we're mostly driven by appropriative water rights, meaning first in time, first in right, and it's not harnessed to the river like a riparian right, you can move those water rights around. So it's an option, and water transfers really could be a real benefit for us if done right. It can make water more efficient, build a lot more flexibility and resiliency in the system, recharge of groundwater, and water for environmental benefits, meaning you can purchase water rights and keep it in stream for in-stream flows. Or you could purchase water rights to put out on wildlife refuges in the fall and winter when the birds are moving through the system. There's 3 kinds of water transfers that are out there. There's one called groundwater substitution, which means that if I'm a farmer, I've got appropriative rights, I'm gonna sell you my rights to use for a period of time, but I'm not gonna stop growing what I'm growing, I'm just gonna pump my groundwater, and you can have my surface rights. Then there's crop idling or efficiency or land fallowing, and that means the farmer's gonna change how they're using their land. They're either not going to plant, which is fallowing, and then they'll take the water that they would have used for that and they sell it to someone else. Or they can be efficient. So like down in the Imperial Valley, the big water transfer there, it started off with fallowing, but it's supposed to switch over to efficiency, meaning they used to just pour water across fields in the old sheet flow, and then the water would go into tailwater and flow into the Salton Sea. But now they're talking about doing much more targeted irrigation, so you're not just sort of flooding fields. And that would save water. And that water savings would then be used the water that you sell. And then reservoir reoperation is another way to do it, but that's actually quite complicated, and actually you don't really see much of reservoir reoperation. Why do you not see more water transfers? I call it the ghost of Owens Lake, and I'm stealing that from Ellen Hannock, who with the Public Policy Institute of California, who's actually quite brilliant and writes extensively on these issues. But Owens Lake, what I said before, was when Frank Mulholland from LADWP went up, bought up a bunch of land, and moved the water from Owens Lake down to LA, and that's why you have the lovely city of LA. But unfortunately, it dewatered the whole Owens Lake and created the biggest air quality hazard in the state of California. That's a dust storm coming up off the Owens Lake. And it's cost LADWP more than $1 billion now in environmental mitigation to deal with this problem. But the other issue is that I'm going to just get to barriers to the water. It's third-party impacts are big barriers to water transfers because there's a lot of concern about people from the source area. So if someone's going to take their water and they're going to sell it to someone else outside of your area, the folks that live in that area are very worried about that. What does that mean if you're going to fallow land? How is that changing the agricultural economy in my area? The people that rely on the farmer that used to plant that field, or the people that work those crops, the migrant farm workers. I mean, it becomes an environmental justice issue as well. Then there's issues of, well, okay, I'm going to keep planting my crops, but I'm just going to pump groundwater as I've sold my surface water. That happened in the Sacramento Valley, and in the area called Butte County, there was a big drop in the water aquifer there, and there was big concern that Farmer X was selling his water right and still continuing to plant and pumping groundwater, and then Farmer Y over here is having to drop his well even further at great expense. So those are big issues, and in response, a number of counties in California have passed ordinances making it a lot harder to move water. And then, of course, there's the environmental impacts. The process is incredibly complex, and there's just a fundamental lack of information and data. So solutions, which is my last slide. One real big issue for us to be able to do more water transfers is to get a handle on our groundwater. How much do we have? How much is being used? Who's using what? And with the passage of groundwater legislation last year, I think we're slowly, very slowly starting in that direction. Addressing third-party impacts is another one. Environmental impacts is another issue. Uniformity in data collection, and I think we'll see bills in the legislature this year on this particular issue. And then, frankly, I think if you're going to be trying to boot up a big water transfer market, you need to be setting it up so that you're also prioritizing water transfers that can benefit low-income communities and the environment. And so it's not just moving water to LA or San Diego or to the big corporate almond growers in the Westlands Water District, but that you're also looking at all of the various folks that can be served by having a water market. Thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker is Ryke longest.
I'm going to go sit over there.
Thanks and good afternoon. My talk is sponsored by the Almond Growers Association of California. No, I'm just kidding. So this afternoon we're going to talk a little bit about Western water rights, and I thought I would start with a slide that I just went ahead and stole from my colleague Chuck Podolak. And the slide, I think, is a good illustration of some structural issues when we're talking about Western water law, especially that's really important to use. And I want to recognize that we've made an intentional top-down hierarchy here. There certainly could be, if we had people of certain political persuasion here, who might put this at the top of the hierarchy and everything else down below it. But I'm just going to say, for sake of argument, that we're going to think about federalism here in the United States, and we're going to think about the importance of the different levels of water management and the different actors that we see, especially prevalent in the West. First, there are international commitments, and these are commitments not where the UN is actually saying to the United States, thou shalt use water this way, UN 21, what have you. What we're talking about here are actually treaty commitments and international law commitments that we as a sovereign nation have entered into with other countries. And in the West, the primary entity we're going to be focusing on there is Mexico. But that's certainly what we think of as being one of the hierarchy. And what's important there is, once you've established a treaty, a federal agency, such as the Bureau of Reclamation, is bound to follow and abide by our treaty obligations. So once the United States enters into a treaty, as it has with Mexico over the Colorado River, the federal agencies are bound to follow that treaty. Then you have the federal agencies, and we have a whole variety of federal agencies and programs. I could fill up an entire slide. Those of you who have to suffer through my water resources law class know that I have such a slide. I'm not going to pull it out today, but there's an entire slide full of all the federal agencies that deal with water management. We heard from Interior earlier, Bureau of Reclamation, Corps of Engineers, but that's just the beginning. There's a whole slew of those federal agencies. Then we have the states and their various actors. And they have, underneath the state agencies, and this includes things like the courts, which help determine the nature of the water rights regime within the state. And in the West, we're talking about prior appropriation, and also the state legislatures and the constitutions that they have, Colorado's constitution being a very important source of its law on prior appropriation. And then you heard earlier about the new California groundwater law, a relatively new innovation another creature of statute, but the states play a really key role in the allocation of water among user groups within state boundaries. And then you have the various user groups, including things like muni water districts, mutual ditch companies, irrigation districts, the Bureau of Reclamation itself taking water and then in turns giving it to irrigation districts, and then in some cases going to these mutual ditch companies. And then you have the end water user, which is the person who is going to be calling their representative, senator, governor, and others to complain about the decisions that have been made about their water from everybody above them. So I wanted to put this slide up there just to give you a framework of how complex this is. And many times, disputes may occur at one level and replicate back up this way, so that issues that are affecting the end water users here are also traveling up this chain and leading to pressure in terms of changing things around. Sometimes that pressure can be for the good. So I want to focus for the minutes that I have talking specifically about the Colorado River. So we've heard a good bit about California, and that's really important because California is the most important player on the Colorado River as far as a single state goes. So this picture over here helps you see the Colorado River Basin. Here's California over here, Nevada, Las Vegas right here. We heard about Lake Mead earlier. We have Lake Powell right here in the upper basin. Then we have the Havasu down here, and then we have the Gila and the Arizona and New Mexico tributaries flowing into the Colorado from the east. And then we have the border. And this little piece here, San Luis Rio, Colorado, which this is a picture taken by Peter McBride of that delta taken from the air. I show this to show you that this tends to show a blue line going all the way through and cutting into the sea, but it doesn't usually reach the sea. Now this picture up here is from the Department of the Interior, and it is a projection of water supply crises in the West by the year 2025. Now, 2025 to you young people may seem like it's a long time away, but to someone of my age, it's in terms of planning horizon from a water supply perspective, this is right around the corner. So we see that a number of these are in red with a significant potential for water crises, including significantly developed areas in Texas, and then all areas right down through here, right in the Colorado River basin that we've just been looking at. So the Colorado, in many ways, I think, is ground zero for interstate and, to an extent, lesser extent, but to an extent, international water crisis. But certainly, as a matter of interstate water crisis, the Colorado Basin is one of the examples of that. So this river has been managed under a series of different pieces of court cases, court challenges, court decisions, a interstate set of compacts that were approved by Congress, and by subsequent authorizing acts of Congress for specific projects, as well as administrative rules. Collectively, we'll refer to this as the law of the river. It is a body of law into itself. I teach a water resources law course. We spend one day on the law of the river. We could spend an entire semester just talking about the law of the river. We still wouldn't get all the issues right. I certainly can't cover it in 5 minutes. Suffice it to say, it is a highly complicated process wherein these states have allocated amongst themselves portions of the Colorado River for their uses inside their respective state borders. And it roughly is an even split between the upper basin states and the lower basin states. And one of the most important aspects of that is the role of California among the lower basin states. We saw earlier a picture showing the canal that's transferring water from the Colorado Basin into Southern California. This is a quote from a text that I often use to talk about this issue. In 1931, California agreed to limit its rights to Colorado River water to 4.4 million acre-feet annually, yet the state regularly diverts 5.2 or even 5.3 million thanks to annual declarations by U.S. Secretary of the Interior. There's a surplus of water available. If they actually had to live within its allotment of 4.4, they'd face a stark reality. And what that stark reality is that the basin split the water between the upper basin users and the lower basin users. But the upper basin users have grown more slowly than California has. They have not been as economically dynamic. They have not been as exploitative or consumptive in their uses of the water. And they have not used fully all of that water. So what's happened is California has been allowed to draw down, if you will, the surplus and excess water. And there will come a time when that is going to stop. And that's going to be another abrupt, if we're not there, we're there very quickly. This can be a very abrupt and shocking transformation. And it matters a lot because not only is Los Angeles impacted, but really, truly, the salad bowl of America is impacted. I mean, most of us enjoy having a salad in the winter. You can get lettuce, you can get all kinds of wonderful mixed green vegetables. You're not stuck, as my ancestors were in the state of North Carolina. In the winter, we had to rely only on winter greens. My ancestors could not get lettuce in December or January. They had to live on collard greens and turnip greens and maybe some cabbage if they were lucky. Those were what they got for greens, but we're all used to having lettuce all year round. We're used to this abundance of vegetables and fruits. And in large part, it's irrigated agriculture in California is one of the key components of that. And here's a miniature picture. I really like the picture you had better, showed it more blown up. But to show how much of this water is diverted down in the Imperial Valley and the irrigation district there, it's a really critical valuable and commercially valuable agricultural component to the nation. And I don't want to diminish it by what I'm about to say, which is that use for agriculture has been at the expense of wildlife and has actually devastated what was a very vibrant estuary in Mexico and devastated it and turned it basically into a desert. And this is the result of several things playing together. One is the United States' position as the upstream originator of this water. Under international law, you can take the approach that under absolute sovereignty that you have no obligation to transmit water down to a downstream country as a matter of international law. And that's the position the United States took when it was negotiating with Mexico in the 40s. And it's a position that they have taken since. But in 1944, a treaty was signed between the United States and Mexico. And like most of these things, there was more at stake than just water. There was also some issues related to oil. There were some issues related to governance. But the Treaty of 1944 established a right for Mexico to receive water coming from the Colorado. And that right was going to be something that was going to be enforced at the border right here. Now, and right here, you see the border right here. But one of the things that's sort of important to understand there is that most all of that water that was coming across the border into Mexico was actually then used and diverted into irrigated agriculture just south of the border owned by U.S. firms that were operating in Baja California. So the water, even though it crossed over the border, was immediately turned into irrigation, and only under very, very wet years do you actually see a tremendous influx of water down into what historically had been an abundant wetland. And this is what remains of, in this aerial photograph, what remains of a wetland that had extended as a large delta all the way here south of the border down to the sea. And what happened is, as a result of a readjustment of the interests between the parties, and most importantly, the timely intervention by water users and non-governmental organizations working together with the governments of Mexico and the United States, they actually talked the governments to come to the table and not renegotiate the Treaty of 1944, but to reinterpret it through what's called Minute 319. Not a very long document as treaties go, or interpretations of treaties go. This is the entire sum total of it, but very, very significant. I think it's significant for several reasons. One is the obligations of the Treaty of 1944 still remain in force, and that's the baseline under which this minute was negotiated. But what happened is new political forces, especially those brought to bear by non-governmental organizations, made the governments realize several important things. One, when 1944 treaty was negotiated, the importance of maintaining ecological flows to support this ecosystem were not recognized by either government. Now they are. Two, a recognition that water issues are more complex and more regional and are interconnected. That is, it's not just I'm going to take as much out as I can and put back as little as I can and be selfish approach, but actually that all of these communities are interdependent one on the other was another important recognition here. And the third, I think, was recognizing that there was an opportunity here because of the differing economic value to create what is, in essence, a new potential for a new way of thinking about water trades. And we already heard water trades are the ways in which we're going to primarily figure out how to adjust adjust expectations of people who already have a right to use water, but also may be in a position to sell that right or transfer it for another purpose to other entities. And so the hope is that we're going to see more examples like this where water was released into the main dry channel of the river, of the Rio, and made its way all the way down to the sea. This is an example of paddle boarders who were going all the way down to the Sea of Cortez following a river that had been shuttered off. There's a wonderful National Geographic 20-minute short film Mr. McBride has on YouTube if you are interested in seeing more of the history of that. And what happened as a result of this was two things. One is a river that was dead was brought back to life. Two, the people of the valley found that they had a resource. Here we have an example. It was just a few hours after the water was returned, carp started moving into this delta again, and people started catching fish. And they also were able to then start reestablishing, volunteers have been working tirelessly to get rid of invasive species. When you change a system like this and you dry it up, you start to see invasive species come in and native species like cottonwoods go away. As soon as the water started coming back in, they were able to go back in with cottonwoods and start planting these things and start reestablishing some of that flow. So the non-governmental organizations coming to the table, raising private funding and showing the importance and value of these ecological services to the governments played a key role in bringing these two governments to the table. The need for the Mexican government for some financial assistance to help them with repairing their irrigation infrastructure south of the border due to the Mexicali earthquake was also a contributing factor, bringing them to the table. For the United States, the ability to start thinking about the allocation that was under the Colorado River Compact and the Treaty of 1944, the law of the river had been given to Mexico. The ability to revisit that through this minute process opens up the possibility of adaptive management. And what I mean by that is that we ought to get to a place in the West, we're going to have to get to a place in the West, where we take the treaties, the obligations, the laws that are on the books, use those as frameworks and boundaries for our understanding of what can happen, and then use that to open up the market forces to help us do some bargaining. And the bargaining may be under the threat of the treaty. We have a right to ask for this, we have a right to ask for that. But the bargaining can take place nonetheless. And I think that's something that we're going to hear more about as well, talking about economics of this. But the water trade and the ability to bring parties to the table that had been what I think were fairly intractable positions and open them up is really the thing that I find most exciting about 319. So any event, I'll be watching to see how this goes in days to come. And I will flip back to the slide because you said you wanted to borrow it. Your old slide?
I'm good. Just keep in mind that crazy chart that Ryke had.
Okay.
It's so graciously stolen. I don't have any. You want to pull it up or anything? Okay. So I'm Chuck Podolak. I'm work as a staffer for Senator Jeff Flake from Arizona. And as such, I feel obligated to contradict my good friend Ryke in his characterization that California is the most important state on the Colorado River. Everything I say after that comment reflects only my own opinions. It does not, my obligatory disclaimers, I'm speaking only for myself today. I think I I can say that reflects the position of my boss. Everything else I say, though, is not intended to be the opinion of Senator Flake. What I want to talk about, I do want to leave some time for questions. I want to talk a little bit about the rules of the game. And when we talk, we've heard some value judgments about alfalfa, about almonds. We've talked about some federal, big picture basin ideas, ideas from the federal perspective about how to manage drought and water in the West. We've heard some of the constraints that are put on water uses through things like the Endangered Species Act and demands that puts on different water users. I think all that needs to be viewed at, and all those actions need to be viewed at through the existing rules of the game, or the session, it was, I think, supposed to be on Western water law. So I want to talk a little bit about how I see that, how I view the rules of the game. I think some of that's informed on, I'll touch on my background a little bit. I get into this water law and policy more from the scientific side, so coming at it from a background in fluvial geomorphology or understanding the physics of water and rocks and how that interacts to change how rivers work. Building on that background, I spent a couple of years here at Duke doing some teaching and research, mostly looking at the question that Kim brought up about why aren't there more water transfers, or why isn't water moving from one place to the other? What's holding those things up? That led to a lot of work on the institutions, this crazy chart that Ryke was showing. And then for the last year and a half, I've been up on Capitol Hill doing a wide portfolio of issues, but that includes for the state of Arizona water and drought policy. So I've thought a lot about what can be done at the federal level, what's the appropriate level of the federal government, how much can the federal government direct or influence where water is and where water isn't in the Western U.S. So for those of us Westerners who sort of grew up around this stuff, it seems very natural. The more time I spend out on this side of the country of people looking out at the West and think this is crazy. You guys have all this pipes and aqueducts, and you're growing lettuce in Yuma, Arizona. And I would like to point out that since it is February, almost every I would wager that every piece of lettuce that we had on our sandwiches today originated in Yuma, Arizona. It was probably picked within the last 4 or 5 days. And so much of the greens is grown in California in the summertime, but in the wintertime, almost all that comes from Colorado River water that grew that lettuce that we all ingested over lunch today. But if you have any desire to change what that pattern of water use is in the Western U.S., I think you have to understand the rules of the game that drive that, which I think goes to the title of this thing, right, is Western water law. So why is there a Western? Why use that adjective in front of it? And that's to distinguish it from Eastern water law. And the main principle that distinguishes Eastern water law and Western water law is the idea of prior appropriation. And two of the previous speakers touched on that. The fundamental or the central tenet to water use in the Western U.S. is you have a property right to use a certain amount of water, and that right has a priority date to it. So what we've said is the first person to use water gets their full entitlement, and really what prior appropriation is it's a way to divide up shortage. So when there's not enough water to accommodate everyone's desired water use, who takes the brunt of shortage? In the Western U.S., we say the newest people do. So the most junior water users, or the water users with the latest priority date, they get their entitlement in full cut off short. They get zero entitlement, and you continue to go down the line until you have some water users that are getting their entire entitlement and some water users who are getting zero entitlement. And you distinguish that from broad characterization of Eastern water law, but the shortage is more generally shared across a group of users rather than those individual users. And now, when you can define a prior appropriation right, you know where you sit in that line of people who are going to get water. So if you have very, very senior users, you are, even in the worst drought, you're pretty sure that senior water right is going to get its full entitlement. So that becomes a very valuable property right. As Kim pointed out, that property right can be moved. So if you have water that's being used to grow alfalfa in La Paz County, Arizona, that water could be used to, you could take that water right, you could move it, say, somewhere else. Up in Mojave County, and you could use that to support mining operations. So that right can be moved around. And the important thing is, as you move that water right around, that priority date or that seniority stays with the water right. So it becomes this very valuable piece of property. And I think that's the two very important things to think about with this prior appropriations is there's a priority right and this transferability. I think that's a very good thing. I think it's a well-defined property right that we can shift around, and that sets up the framework for dealing with, or we have a legal ability to shift water around in a way that's not possible out in the eastern U.S. The flip side to that is that many people will criticize prior appropriation as the equity part. Because there's a priority date, a lot of the very senior water use is dedicated to agriculture. A lot of those uses date back to the mid-1800s. So those agricultural water users who were there first, the first in time, first in right, are the most senior and therefore have a lot of control and a lot of say over where water gets reallocated in the western U.S. A lot of the municipal uses date back to early 1900s and mid-1900s. That's, maybe broadly your sort of second tier or second priority water rights. And then a lot of the recreational and environmental uses, the in-stream flows, are very, very junior water rights. So you may look at that and say, well, this is not fair, or this shouldn't be the way, agriculture should not be more important or have a higher priority than environmental uses or municipal uses. But that's the system that we've set up, and those are the rules of the game that apply. And so we talked about the prior appropriation is the picture that Ryke stole from me. All those other boxes aren't prior appropriation. So prior appropriation applies at the state level between water rights. As you go above the state level to the interstate level, there are some prior appropriations principles that may apply between states, but those, rather than I was here first, how water gets allocated between states is primarily voluntary state compacts, sometimes Supreme Court cases, and in some cases through congressional apportionment. And then I think Ryke already touched on, as you go to the international level, obviously I care about the Colorado River, but I think that's probably the four big ones are the Red River up going into Canada from the Dakotas, the Columbia River's another not quite as dry and as tight of a river, if you will, but have some significant international disputes on the Columbia River, and then the Rio Grande River is probably the other one. So it's kind of the big four international western rivers. And then if you take that down below the state level, so within the irrigation districts, within the Bureau of Reclamation projects, within the municipal water supply districts, especially your big wholesalers like the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California or MET, the users within MET or the users within Northern Colorado, the Colorado Big Thompson project, the users within any of these irrigation districts, prior appropriation does not govern within that. So there are different rules depending on which institution or which of those institutions that you're operating in. So when we talk about moving water around, it's oftentimes very easy to reallocate uses within those small organizations, but really difficult to reallocate water between those institutions. And so if you want to move water, let's say that you have a farmer in some part of central California and you say, well, he's growing alfalfa, that's really stupid. That water should end up in this refuge over here. We can make that judgment. They say, okay, well, how do you do that in accordance with the rules? Well, if that's crossing a Bureau of Reclamation project boundary, now you have to deal with reclamation with the authorized project purposes and with all the reclamation laws. If that water's originating within an irrigation district, you have to deal with the rules of the irrigation district. And then you have to deal with how you physically get it moved from one to the other. So as Kim pointed out, there's a lot of plumbing there, but each of those plumbing systems has different rules for how you can move water. So how you move water through the Central Arizona project is different than the Colorado River Aqueduct, which is different than the State Water Project. So there's all those systems, and we look at the Western U.S. and say it looks really sort of goofy, and I don't like us growing almonds here. I want them to grow fish over here with that water, and after looking at this from a long time, from the academic perspective here and then from the federal perspective, I think that's one of the conclusion I come to is a lot of it is just because of all those different rules of the game. So it's either sort of accepting that or figuring out a way to go through the rules of the game, or as some people try and do is to change those rules of the game or change those laws, both that sort of state level prior appropriations or the interstate rules and the intrastate rules. I think that's enough on my soapbox. I think we have about 15 more minutes, so I'm going to shut up there and maybe open it up to questions.
let's have some questions. I'm going to start with one that really impressed me in your presentation. How do you go from geomorphology and fluvial issues to such a detailed description of law? And that's impressive.
I think the fights in water law and policy are more interesting than the fights in geomorphology.
Well, I was pleased to see some commonality between our speaker just before our session and this Public Policy Institute in California, where they're talking about federal action could have greatest impact in the following areas. Leveraging federal authority to resolve key water conflicts. We've heard some of that here. Coordinating federal actions to align agency efforts and priorities. Changing agricultural support systems or programs to create watershed scale benefits. That, from the last speaker, may be a little more difficult.
Well, I think when we talk about what crops are grown where, there's far be it from me, and I think Tom pointed out too, you know, the Bureau of Reclamation or the federal government is not in the business of telling you what you can and can't grow some places. But if you ask the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I don't know that they'd agree with that. There are a lot of incentives and programs where the federal government does sort of incentivize the growing of certain crops in general or certain crops in certain places. And I think I would agree with the author's recommendations there if, you know, I think it's one thing for us to say you shall not grow alfalfa in the desert Southwest. It's another one for us to say, well, you know, here's some money if you go grow this crop. And I think it's worth looking at especially through the Department of Agriculture, how we incent different crops.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, it's, I think if you've walked away from the discussion today on Western water, you've come away with one thing, which is it's really complicated. It's ridiculously complicated. It's a wicked problem, as some people would say. With ag supports, you know, I mean, the thing is that almonds, for example, which by the way, I'm not anti-almond. I actually like them very much. I just don't think you should be breaking out new almond groves in the midst of a 4-year drought. I have a little problem with that. But a lot of those crops are considered specialty crops. They're not commodities. So in some ways, there's not, the USDA isn't really driving the cropping. That's kind of old school. You know, when we used to do price supports for like sugar and cotton and rice, actually, which we do have in California. But maybe there's a way of maybe trying to incentivize, I don't know, because it might be too expensive, where you would be paying farmers not to grow something in a certain place. The problem there also, and this is just, again, shows the complexity of it, like, for example, on the alfalfa issue, at least in California, and I would hazard a guess, maybe even in Arizona and other parts, where we've so altered the hydrology and natural system that the species that have persisted have learned to evolve in a highly altered landscape. And so an alfalfa field, from a Swainson's Hawk perspective, is awesome because they don't have enough grassland to persist in. So we've created a situation where it's not so simple to say, I think it's stupid to grow alfalfa in the Imperial Valley because it's a desert, for God's sakes. But you look at the amount of migratory birds that move through that valley, a vast majority of them rely on the agricultural fields. And if you take those agricultural fields away, where else are they supposed to go? Because we've paved over, you know, the other places, or we've converted. So it's not simple. It's not a simple thing. It's all interconnected. And so I just want to make that point, because I think I even am guilty of it. We tend to oversimplify things like, oh, almonds are bad, alfalfa in the desert is dumb. But I just, you know, it's a very tricky issue to deal with. And the price support piece, I don't know, I feel like, at least my experience in California, is the cost, the profit margin for growers and what they can make off is a much bigger driver. So the fact that China has become a huge consumer of products is driving more our market in California than anything else.
Question back there?
I have a question about water transfers. Do you mean that water transferring of like water rights within the same water body, or it could be in between, like mixing different streams with the water rights?
It can be it could be different things. So there's you can transfer. So what happens if I'm just gonna use an example, I'm a farmer, I have an allocation where I have a priority of say 5,000 acre feet. And I use it to grow rice. But Metropolitan Water District needs water, and they're willing to pay me more than what I would make off my rice crop. So I'll make more money transferring my right to that 5,000 acre feet of water to sell it to Metropolitan Water District, maybe for that year or maybe for like 10 years, depending on, what the deal is. Metropolitan Water District now, so I won't take that water out of the Sacramento River. It'll keep going down the Sacramento River, and it'll have to now move through the Sacramento River into the Delta, down through the State Water Project and the pumping plant down there, and down through the California Aqueduct and to Metropolitan Water District. So when Brad Pitt turns on his water spout, now rice water will be flowing out of his tap. So you can do it something as complicated as that, or you could do something as simple as farmer X in the same basin, says I've got a junior right, and so I'm not sure I'm going to get my 5,000 acre feet, so I'm going to pay so-and-so over here, and it'll be within, maybe be within, I don't know, a mile of the Sacramento River where farmer X would take it in and farmer Y is now taking it in. It just very depends, and and because of the prior appropriation doctrine, you can move things around. But of course, the farther you use that water from the place of origin, it creates all these other issues that come up when I was talking about third-party impacts. So
I think on the simple end, you have, two farmers in the same irrigation district on the same lateral who are literally neighbors, and you're like, well, instead of opening your head gate, I'm going to open my head gate and take that water that you were going to take last week. That would be one of the simplest. I think the other simple one that we see in urbanizing former agricultural areas like the Phoenix metropolitan area is you have a, 80-acre parcel of land, and the farmer decides he's going to stop farming and he's going to sell that to a subdivision, which might only use 1/4 of what the farmer's water use is. So he sells the subdivision 1/4 of that, and then he has 3/4 of whatever he was using. He sells that to the local municipal water provider. So it's the water might still be coming out of the exact same river at the exact same spot, but it was a transfer of the water right. And then I think Kim described probably the most complicated version of that is where you're moving water from Blythe, California, or from the Sacramento River down into the water district.
And I was just going to briefly say that I think we all suspect that a lot more of the transfers that take place are these casual, informal, neighbor-to-neighbor, small-scale transfers than the Owens Lake, let's go and buy all the rights out. And
yeah, they get all the attention.
They get the attention, but the actual the changes are actually these informal transfers. Yeah,
in California, I would say ag to ag is the most common transfer that you'll see, and usually within the same basin. So from the west side of the valley to the east side of the valley or something like that. You don't see very many, and you see more ag to environment. You don't see as many ag to urban, and you certainly don't see as many long-term. So it'll be, a lot of transfers are 1-year deals. But say like the 30-year transfer between the Imperial Irrigation District and San Diego County Water Authority and Coachella Valley Water District, something like that, that is like those are more uncommon. But that did provide San Diego now with 30 years of water, so it can continue to grow. Yes.
There's obviously been more stress on water resources. Some people have been bringing up put people before fish, and there was the Western Water and Food Security Act passed last year introduced last year trying to push forward that agenda. So in times like this of drought in the West, how can we make sure we preserve ecologic flows?
Yeah. That is a really good question. Yeah, I hate the people versus fish thing because I actually think it's such a false argument. But unfortunately, we spend a huge amount of political time talking about that. You know, there's not going to be an easy fix to that. I think I've raised the issue of water transfers because that's one possible way of maybe moving, you know, keeping more water in the system through allocation of water rights. Reservoir reoperation combined with whatever we end up doing with the Delta. It took us 100 years to get into this mess, and we're not going to get out of it in a couple of years. And there is not a quick and easy solution to do so. So I guess my answer is I wish we'd spend less time wasting it on these sort of side conversations that are doing nothing and just focus in on really trying to address some of the key solutions. We're getting there. I think we've made a lot of headway in California. It'd be great if we could get some help.
Part of that, the act you're talking about is a bill that passed the House late last year that's dealing with drought. When you look at these actions, and I know Tom talked about it as well, the federal government can't make any more water, and a lot of those boxes that we're talking about where water is going is not controlled by the federal government. I think one of the controversial parts of that bill that you're talking about, and its competing bill in the Senate is, how do we treat the Endangered Species Act? And can you give some, is there any leeway you can give or any sort of temporary relief from some of the Endangered Species Act driven management decisions? And that's really the crux of what people in Congress are fighting about right now between all the California delegations is, that there are two different versions of essentially that same act, and they have differing levels of how you treat the Endangered Species Act. And that's, I think, one of the, at least from what we see dealing at the federal level with California, that's the biggest question is there any flexibility in some of those management decisions that would allow the water to move around a little bit more?
Right.
And are we sending good quality water across the border? I wonder about that desalination plant that was
desalting plant.
funded and
Turn that
Mothballed.
but that it's not just quantity but quality, and to make something work with the product that goes. We have 3 hands showing. Let's go to the back, please.
Might just take one.
Okay.
What are the big legal questions on the horizon right now with California groundwater regulation?
What are the big legal questions?
Yeah, what are people wondering in terms of the legal framework for this emerging regulatory regime?
I almost feel like it's a little early to tell. We literally passed the bill a year ago or 2 years ago. We're just setting up the groundwater, what do you call it? I'm totally having a senior moment, but the districts that we're going to be then managing within. And, I don't think this is, so I don't know if there's been any really big legal questions that have come through at this point. My biggest question will be, can we get this all together in a time frame that's actually relevant to addressing the problem? Because in order to pass the legislation, we had to compromise and take a very long lead-in time to the management, to the point where we're actually ratcheting things down and starting to manage. And I'm concerned that we're not going to get to the real heart of it until we've really pumped the heck out of our groundwater. But that's not a legal question. That's more of like a policy question. As far as the legal issues, I don't know, maybe one of you guys know.
Speaking from the other side of the river, from a state that has a lot older groundwater management code, it's what you do with people's existing wells. And in Arizona, we've had a groundwater management code since 1980, which predated a lot of the wells. So the idea was in these fast-growing urban areas, you put in a code that regulates how much water you can take out, and then you're regulating. So a lot of the wells that are regulated under that are wells who have gone in since 1980. In California, on the other hand, you are regulating wells that are already in and pumping. And And so how do you, you know, your ability to control someone's right that they've already been exercising, I think is probably the difference in a, you know, an old, relatively old groundwater management code and a new groundwater management code.
Yeah,
So
they're
that-
just literally
that's a
trying to
great-
figure out how many wells are out there and what are they actually pumping. I mean, we're,
Is our ability to quantify what's being removed from aquifers and use that as information to enforce?
that's the hope.
Yeah,
We can do that, we can do that really good on a large scale. So, you know, our ability to measure, you know, tiny changes in gravity and, you know, management or and aquifer levels that's pretty good. But, you know, when you have wells without, you know, without any measurements on them, you don't know what you're taking out.
Right.
Well, I'd like to thank our speakers and thank you for your participation. Thank you very much.